The first thing that I did for this tent project was make myself a prototype. The original plan was to make the final tent out of Dyneema, and because of this I wanted to try and make a mock-up of a fabric that was as similar to that as possible. I chose to make my mock-up out of Tyvek. I started out by sewing some Tyvek together long ways so that my starting piece of fabric would be very much similar to if I started out with Dyneema. Once I had this ready to go, Raiden and I measured out all of the triangular panels and drew them onto the Tyvek. We used a tape measure and a piece of skirting board from Home Depot as a straight edge to draw all the triangles on. I somehow managed to miss filming it, but we put catenary curves into most of the straight edges of the tent. Once they were all drawn onto the Tyvek, I cut them out with my kitchen scissors. I didn't want my sewing scissors going anywhere near this fabric. This tent has been a long time in the making. When I was making this Tyvek tent, it was the middle of Canadian winter, and so I couldn't put the tent up outside. Instead, I attached 4 hooks to my living room floor so I could practice putting it up indoors. It didn't work as well as I'd hoped. It was really hard to get the tension right on the guy lines, and it was a little bit difficult when you couldn't move the tent stake around because it was stuck to the floor. I made a few alterations to it to try and get the tension right across the tent, but essentially I ended up shelving it until it was warm enough to take outside again. What you see here is the final Tyvek tent. We took it outside a couple of times and sort of tested it out. We took it in a few places to try and get nice even panels and nice smooth curves, and this is what we ended up with. We hadn't fully sorted out the closure system yet, and we wanted to add a couple of extra guy lines at the doors, but otherwise we were pretty happy with it at this stage. The last thing I did on the Tyvek tent was take it all apart again, on my very messy living room floor. What this meant is that I could keep the pieces and use them as a pattern for the final version. It seemed much better than trying to draw anything out from scratch. Because the tent's symmetrical, I only needed to take apart half of it. The other half turned into the pack prototype, which you've already seen. After the prototype for the outside of the tent was complete, the next thing for me to do was make the mesh inner. I didn't make a prototype for the mesh inner, and instead I just made it based on my measurements from my original design. I started off by cutting out the mesh panels. It turns out that drawing onto mesh is nigh on impossible. I was using a white chalk marker and ended up drawing much more on the floor than I did on the fabric. After cutting out the 2 panels for the doors, I then placed the remainder of the fabric on top of itself, so I only had to mark out the end walls once. Somehow I managed to get an awful lot of footage of me dithering around with these doors, but not any actual footage of me putting in the door zippers. So here's my explanation of what I did. Without cutting the door panels, I pinned the zippers onto the outside of the triangles. Then I took it over to my sewing machine and sewed it on top of the mesh. After it was sewed on, I went back with a pair of scissors and carefully snipped the mesh on top of the zipper teeth so that there was an opening underneath the zipper. After that, I folded back the extra mesh and top stitched it in place. I promise that next time I make a tent, I'll get better video footage so I can explain this fully. Once the zips were in the doors, the next thing for me to do was to sew together the rest of the mesh body. I started out with the ridgeline of the mesh inner and then moved on to the rest of the body. I top stitched all of my seams in place. After finishing fluffing around with the mesh, it was time to move on to the bathtub floor. The bathtub floor was made out of 1.1 ounce Silpoly with PU 4000 coating. I decided to use a slightly heavier fabric than the Fly for the floor because it had a higher waterproof rating and it would probably be in direct contact with pooling water. Once the two floor panels were cut out, I sewed them together directly down the middle, then top stitched that seam in place. The corners of the bathtub floor were made using an origami method. By folding instead of sewing the corners in place, it meant that I would have no seams in those corners, meaning that's one less place for water to get in. I put a little row of stitching within my seam allowance to hold the folds in place. Then I pinned the mesh to the inner the whole way around the top of the bathtub floor. After this was done, I sewed it all in place. I just had to tidy up some of my loose threads, and I was good to go. The first step for making my tent fly was to cut out all the pieces. After doing a little bit of research online, I found out that the best way to stop my seams from twisting was to make sure that the grain lines were a mirror image at each seam. To do this, I figured out how I wanted each piece to sit on the grain and drew the grain line onto my pattern pieces. Then I could line that up with the grain on my fabric when I lay it out. I held my pattern pieces down using whatever canned food I happened to have in my pantry at the time, and drew around each piece on the fabric using a chalk marker. I labelled each corner of the tent with ABCs so that I could match them up when I was constructing the tent, and then I went ahead and cut everything out. When I made the prototype, I made it out of Tyvek, which doesn't stretch at all. However, the fabric that I ended up using for the fly was woven, and so it had a little bit of stretch. To stop my door panels from stretching, I ended up gluing a little piece of straight grained fabric along the edge, folding it under and sewing it in place. Next, it was time to sew the whole fly together. I tried to lay it all out on the floor, but the space I had available really wasn't quite big enough. started out with the ridgeline, then the side roof panels, and then the door panels. Each panel I sewed with right sides together first, and then opened it up and top stitched the seam flat. One of the bottom edges ended up a little bit wonky, so I just ruled a new straight edge and trimmed off the excess. Then I used some soap and water to clean off the chalk marker that had explained to me how to put it all together. Next thing I did was tidy up all my loose threads. Then it was time for reinforcing patches. I used my scraps to cut out the patches and then glued them onto the tent using a thinned down silicone solution. I did 2 large patches in the peaks where the poles would go into support, and then smaller patches on the corners where the tie-outs would go. I had to leave this to dry overnight before I could keep going. I top stitched the edges of all of these patches in place. The next thing I did was hem the tent the whole way round. After the bottom was hemmed, it was time to add on my line locks for the guy out points. I also had to add on to the mesh tent the places where I could connect the mesh to the fly. I used elastic to attach hooks to the mesh and then put the guy lines onto my fly. Then I took it outside and set it up, and I have to say I was really proud of myself. I thought it looked awesome. And then I tried to put the mesh tent inside the fly and I found some serious problems. The mesh tent was too long for the fly. I had no idea what had gone wrong, so I went back inside, got out my measuring tape and had a look. So just like I thought when I was outside, the mesh tent was longer than the fly, and the fly was 40 centimeters shorter than it should be based on the measurements in my book. Alright, so I feel like I just have to record this now while I'm in this very sad state of mind. Today I sewed together the fly for the tent and it went together beautifully. Got all the tie-outs, everything on it, went outside to pitched it. It was great. Went to put the inner up inside to check where I needed to put the tie-out points, and the inner didn't fit inside the tent. After fluffing around for a little while, I couldn't figure out what was going on. Brought it back inside and did some measuring and found out that one side of the tent is 40 centimeters too short. So essentially I've made a square instead of making a rectangle. And that means obviously that the inner is too long to fit inside the fly. We are going away in a week and we're using this tent in a week. I don't have any extra fabric. I can't remake the doors. The fabric came from the US and I am in Canada, so there's no way I can get more fabric before then. So Yeah, I'm desperately trying to come up with a solution. Essentially, the fly is only 230 centimeters long when it was meant to be 270, and the inner was meant to be 230 centimeters long. It's like 9:45. I'm not going to do any more on it tonight. I'm thinking that the best thing to do would probably be to turn it into a single wall tent. That way I can take the inner and sew it directly to the fly at the opening, and then just come in, say 10 centimeters on each end, and have the floor come down from there. That will mean that we get 210 centimeters of working length, which is fine. That's about the same length as the lampshade was. However, this floor is not a rectangle, it's a weird parallelogram, so we don't actually get to lie next to each other for that length, because there's meant to be weird offset triangles at the head and feet. So it's not really going to work, I guess is the answer. And I am really annoyed, really upset about it actually. It all seemed like it was going so well, and then I've screwed it up monumentally. Yeah. Don't actually really have a solution for it right now, but I need to come up with one today, tomorrow, just to get us through this trip at least, and then I can go back to the drawing board and design something else. I really thought I had this sorted. Like, I made the Tyvek pattern and used the pattern to make the real tent, and you know, we were so close to buying Dyneema and doing this tent properly, and we didn't because of the cost and the cost to weight ratio between using membrane Silpoly and Dyneema. And Dyneema would have cost us about $370 or $80 worth of materials, and the membrane cost us about $70. So I'm really glad that I only sunk $70 into this, because it doesn't work. It does look really good though. So a really good fly that's not big enough for 2 people to sleep in. I don't know if it's enough to be happy about, but... So the next morning I did a bunch more fluffing around, measuring. I figured out exactly how I managed to screw it up. On the Tyvek tent, the doors weren't really closing properly, and I ended up taking them in and making them shorter to make it sit nicely, and right there is where I managed to cut off that material. I think I cut off about 20 centimeters from each side of the door to make it sit flush, and that's it. There's my 40 centimeters of length gone. So I learned that lesson, and then it was just time to solve it. So the first step in the reconstruction of the tent was to take the inner apart. I completely separated the mesh from the bathtub, and then the different panels of mesh from each other. The next step was to figure out how to make the door panels big enough to work as a single wall tent. It was originally designed to have clearance between the roof of the fly and the mesh, and now the mesh needed to extend all the way up to the ceiling. My solution for this ended up being sewing all of the little bits of leftover bug mesh I had onto the triangles to make them bigger. And it wasn't pretty, and the grain lines didn't line up, but it worked. Next thing I had to do was cut the floor down so that the bathtub was small enough to fit inside the tent. So I remeasured and chopped and got that all sorted. Then I had to refold up the bathtub floor and sew those corners in place. Next I sewed a piece of mesh to the head and foot ends of the bathtub and then sewed the doors directly onto the bathtub as well. I had to undo the hem at the head and foot and then pin the bug net in. Ideally I would have sewn the bug net directly into the seams, but to be honest I was a little bit over it by this point, so I just sewed it on top. It wasn't the prettiest job, but I just wanted to get it done. The last thing I had to do before we were ready to take it on our trip was seam seal it. It was a beautiful sunny day, I got the tent set up, and then did probably the sloppiest seam sealing job you've ever seen in your life. But it worked when it rained on us on the trail, so I'm not going to complain. I meant to get some video footage of the finished tent when we were out in the wild on the Cloche Silhouette. Then every time we were in camp, I was either too tired or the bugs were too bad to be outside. So I did a little bit in the park near my apartment building. To set this tent up, all I have to do is stake out the 4 corners and then insert the poles. I also stake out a guy line at the door to hold the door in place and halfway along the other end of the tent, just for stability. You can see it doesn't sit quite right along the ends, but it still looks okay. The main issue with it is it's just not the right size. The tent ended up weighing in at 730 grams, or about 25.5 ounces for the tent in the stuff sack with all of the guy lines. The door closures on this tent are just a little hook with overlapping fabric, and then it rolls up and there's a magnet closure to hold the door open. I have a similar system on my tarp tent, and I really like it, so I decided to use it here. So you can see on this side, the bathtub floor sits pretty well. This elastic just holds the edge of the bathtub up pretty well. But if I go down to the other end, this corner in particular, it's not sitting quite as nice. And same. And then there's quite a lot of pull in one direction across this floor, but then there's a decent amount of extra on the bottom of here. You can see through here, because of the different grain and because there's a cat cut in the seam, the mesh doesn't quite fit nicely into that seam. And then you can see up here as well, because I've sewn multiple pieces of mesh together, it just doesn't quite sit right. Along the end, I sewed it directly into the hem. It's kind of hard to see, but from 1 week's use we're already getting some pulling in the bug mesh. And on this side, see there's the pulls in the bug mesh which I actually sewed shut. And I'm not sure if that's because I used 0.5 ounce per square yard bug mesh, or just because it got put together and taken apart so many times that it just kind of, got a bit worn. So in the original setup, this was a flat panel through here, and then when I sewed the bug mesh on, it pulled funny. So you can see this really isn't sitting very flat. And then the same along this hem, it used to be a nice straight pulled out hem, but because of the bug mesh under the bottom side of here, it just doesn't, sit quite right anymore. For the doors, we just did a crossover with a hook on the bottom of here. These hooks really aren't that good. Won't be using this again. We can just loosen this off and unhook it there. Thank you for watching this video and joining me on the journey of trying to make this tent. At the time that this video is published, I already have all of the materials I need to make the second version, so I'm really looking forward to getting stuck into it. Subscribe to my channel if you want to hang around and see the next version, which will hopefully be a roaring success.